The Isle of Faces and the Order of Green Men who are said to live there are definitely one of the biggest mysteries in the A Song of Ice and Fire books. They're mentioned very early on in A Game of Thrones, and then sort of just left alone, and they're expected to be very important in the endgame because of the way they're set up, but nothing really of note has happened with them in the actual story so far. Ever since I started this series talking about the magic of A Song of Ice and Fire and trying to figure out where all of this is going to go, people have been asking about the Isle of Faces, and rightfully so. It's set up to be definitely important. And I think I do have an answer as to how it could be important for the endgame of the story, and how it could be very useful, and why it's there in the first place. The isle itself is within the God's Eye Lake and home to the Green Men and many weirwoods. Whenever a traveler tries to visit the island, they are turned away by either currents or strange winds, and therefore essentially no one is allowed to visit. There are a few exceptions to this, one of them being Howland Reed, who was seemingly allowed by the Green Men to visit the Isle of Faces just before he attended the tourney of Harrenhal, and he spent some time there in the year of the False Spring. The Isle of Faces is also said to be the place where the children and the First Men signed the pact. This was obviously a very important event in history, and it is said that all of the faces in the weirwoods on the isle were carved to witness the pact. It's also said that the Order of the Green Men was created to guard the weirwoods on the Isle of Faces, which, given it was happening at the signing of the pact, and given that they are called the Green Men, and they are guarding some weirwoods on this island that no one's allowed to visit, that to me is the most important clue into what they're actually doing. So I have talked about the weirwoods in recent episodes, and you can check them out after this one. They work in either order. But basically one of the ideas that we've talked about is the idea that the weirwoods have been corrupted by their use for blood magic. And potentially one of the things that could be beneficial in the end of the story would be a return to a time of green magic, a time like what seems to have existed in the Age of Heroes, a time that it seems like may have existed before the Pact. So, one of the things that we've discussed is the idea that the Pact essentially was potentially the time that the weirwoods were corrupted, where the children and the First Men, in their war with one another, started using the weirwoods and the green magic to do blood magic and shadow magic to create weapons of war to fight against one another. So potentially, when they come together and create the Pact and birth the old ways, if what we have speculated is true, if this was in some way a corrupting of the weirwoods and this entire world tree type weirwood organism, one thing that I could see happening is if you're doing this, right? Imagine you are taking the giant world tree system and you know what you're doing is potentially going to corrupt the magic for blood magic or for shadow magic, but it is beneficial to you. So, you're doing this thing. If you are actually smart, if this is actually the wisest of both races who have met on the Isle of Faces to form this pact, what I could see them having done is, in their corrupting of the Weirwood network, they also are smart enough to say, hey, before we start using all of this for blood magic and shadow magic, we need to create a seed vault. And that's what I think the Isle of Faces is. It's a seed vault for green magic, the type of magic that they used to do before they corrupted the Weirwood system, before they started bending this system to their will, and using it for whatever magic was done after the Pact. Before the Pact, they were doing green magic, and they essentially create the Green Men, and they put some weirwoods on the Isle of Faces that are actually green magic weirwoods. They're uncorrupted weirwoods that are not connected to the greater outside system, which is then going to be corrupted and used for blood magic. So just in case all of this stuff, all of this magic that you're doing with the World Tree goes wrong, well, humanity has a way out. They have the Isle of Faces, which is essentially a home for the green magic weirwoods to be guarded that could essentially be used as a seed vault in case everything goes wrong, the way it seems like it kind of has over the course of the last 10,000 years since the Pact. So yeah, in summary, that is what I speculate's going on the Isle of Faces. The Green Men are put there to guard the green magic weirwoods. They're not just guarding any normal weirwoods on the Isle of Faces, they are guarding very important weirwoods. So you can see how, with what I've speculated could be important by the end of the series, a return to an era of green magic, it could be very useful having an order who is essentially there guarding green magic secrets and green magic knowledge, as well as green magic weirwoods, which could potentially be used as saplings for a new world tree and a rebirth into a new era of green magic if something should happen to the giant world tree system that is currently corrupted and used for blood magic. And by the end of this series, I think something may be happening to that system that could require the green men on the Isle of Faces to come out and serve the purpose that they were potentially originally put there for, to rebirth the world into a time of new green magic and birth a new green magic weirwood tree. Now, there is actually some real-life precedence for this, because in real life we do have a giant seed vault stored on an island which is guarding the genetic material for a bunch of seeds in case anything would happen to the rest of the outside world. And while the vault itself was not constructed until the early 2000s, meaning George had started the series before this had happened, the actual effort itself to begin preserving this genetic material seems to have begun in the 80s as far as I can tell, and so perhaps this is something that George R.R. Martin, who was a sci-fi writer and who would have probably been up to date on things like the idea of storing away genetic information for later use, well, he may have been aware of the idea of creating a seed vault before the actual one in the world was built, so it would on some level track to me the idea that George R.R. Martin could have been viewing the Isle of Faces on some level as a seed vault, or at the very least, some place to keep and guard old green magical secrets when they could eventually be useful if some greater disaster would befall the world. In fact, it's possible that when they signed the pact, they knew that eventually in time what they were doing was unsustainable, and in time the green men would be needed, in time a return to green magic would be the only way. I could see a situation like that, where the pact was made, essentially knowing that the green men would be needed there. So yeah, I do think that the motivations for the parties involved in the actual story itself do line up, that if the first men and the children were doing this magic with the world tree, and were indeed doing green magic at all, the idea of creating a place that is well protected to preserve the secrets and the knowledge of green magic is definitely something that they would want to do. And also, I think it lines up for it to have been a potential inspiration to George, that there is an island in Norway that at some point in the 80s started the process of trying to make itself into a seed vault. So you have an island in the area of the world that obviously was a big inspiration for a lot of what's going on in A Song of Ice and Fire, and the world tree idea obviously, and they are trying to make a seed vault, so building an island with the seed vault for the world tree in your fantasy story that you begin in the early 90s does seem like a thing that might be on the mind of George R.R. Martin. It all just seems to fit together pretty neatly for me, and it does just really kind of sound like the idea behind the green men anyway, right? Like, there's these green men on this secret island who have all of this ancient magical knowledge. At the very least, they are sort of a vault for this secret magical knowledge, but I think it really does make sense for them to be a literal seed vault for a literal plant that could grow into the world tree for the next age, because they don't want this green magic, new growth magic technology, essentially you could call it, to have been lost to time, so when the pact was made, you create some way to preserve that. Now, who or what the green men are is also a very interesting question that I don't really necessarily have the answer to. There is a little bit of speculation that I could do when you talk about how they're described by Old Nan as having green skin and leaves instead of hair. They kind of sound like children of the forest. They're said to ride elk, which makes them kind of sound like cold hands, but there is all these tales that we have discussed in the past in previous episodes about how the children of the forest seem to be able to interbreed with people, so perhaps it would make some sense that the green men and the children of the forest, the green men could be a descendant of humans and the children of the forest, right? Like, if the pact was signed, it could be in some way sealed with marriage, and the descendants of these lines could live on the Isle of Faces, serving as the green men who in some way appear to be, at least on some level, and at least with the way they're described in some legends, some sort of potential mixture of the two. But then again, we do also have these cases of tales in the past where children of the forest give birth to what appear to be on the outside as just normal human beings, so who really knows, perhaps the green men are in fact some sort of order of children of the forest that have been forgotten to exist and are just thought of as green men, or perhaps they are some sort of hybrid, or perhaps they are, just as the maesters suggest, normal men who wear green clothing and wear horned headdresses. In any case, I do think they are there to guard the ideas of green magic because they will be very important in the end of our story, and they could even be there to guard the literal seeds of a new age of green magic. I have put out a video in the past talking about how I think it was originally the corruption of this world tree that led to the seasons becoming irregular in the first place, and I could see a potential for, using the same magical logic, the world tree's death leading to a stopping of the cycle of the seasons, leading to an endless winter, also known as the Long Night. So therefore, you could be in a situation in the end of our story where the Long Night begins with the death of the World Tree, and therefore the Long Night could potentially end with the planting of a new World Tree, and you could see how the Green Men on the Isle of Faces being a seed vault could come in useful in all of that process, even if there are still a lot of details to be figured out about how all of that will play out. But that is what I have for you today, and that is at this point what I speculate the role of the Isle of Faces is. They are the seed vault for the eventual replanting of the World Tree, for the eventual rebirth of a new age of green magic. Let me know what you think of all that down in the comments, and let me know what you think of this idea and how it tracks along with some of the things that we've talked about in recent episodes. If you haven't seen those, be sure to check them out after this, and make sure to like and subscribe before you go. I'll see you with something else very soon.